to yet another episode of Smash the Bug. I'm your host, Joseph Maxwell. Today we have a special guest from all the way across the Atlantic in Switzerland, a beautiful country I've always wanted to visit myself. His name is Hervé Guétin, and he is from Geneva. He is the Magento Consultant at the Wide company, and we're going to hear from him as far as some of his experiences and what he has done to solve some very common problems in the Adobe Commerce platform. But before we do, please make sure that you have subscribed to the SwiftOtter Inc. channel on YouTube, if that's where you prefer to listen to these podcasts, or on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify, wherever you want to listen to this podcast. If you want to listen to them in your ears, you can easily do it on those podcast platforms. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Hervé Guetin to the stage. Welcome, Hervé. It's good to have you here.
Hey, hello, Joe. Nice to see you.
It's good to have you here. As a person who's been certified 4 times, or achieved 4 certifications, I'd be curious to hear what is your role? So obviously you're a Magento consultant at Wide, but what does that entail?
Yeah, I know consultant is kind of wide name, what you say. The thing is that as Magento workers here in this agency, we can have a very large scale of things that we can do, which could go as consultant from just like feasibility studies up to actual real development or architecture, or just trying to find some resources. So it's very wide operations that we can do. So that's why we have this consultant name, which can encompasses many different things on the whole Magento production cycle, basically.
Nice. Okay. Very well. Well, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess let's jump into our first question. What are some of the worst store configurations issues you've run into in the past year or on a daily basis?
Yeah, the thing is that with store configuration, there's often lots of legacy, meaning that there are many developers, sometimes, 10 people, who've been working on the same project for sometimes several years. And the thing is that as for configuration and the way you manage configurations, it's kind of open. So it means that many developers can do basically like they want, as they want. So it means that sometimes legacy is very hard to understand, and you may have items that are spread over all the configurations. Sometimes it's like in one section, sometimes it's spread over in existing sections, sometimes they create a new section. So to me, that's something that's the most difficult thing, is to try to get into a project, which is often legacy, and try to understand what the other guys wanted to do. And that's also something that's sometimes really difficult to find out. And on top of that, on top of that, it's often hard to see people not implementing properly the config.xml file. So it means that you don't really know what goes where, how it's supposed to behave. So that's, to me, the hardest thing to do when we speak about configuration.
You touch on something that is a bit of a pain point for me as well. I think this is a really good thing to bring up. It's easy to go into a Magento project. Oh, I'm just going to create these custom fields here in store configuration and call it a day. But ultimately, I think it's easy to miss the context of where we are putting these into, and to really sit down and think about where do these fit best. To be frank, I have a bit of a beef with quite a number of module vendors, just a little personal deal here, that put their configuration under their company's name in store configuration. I think this is kind of the similar idea. When I'm looking for, I'm just trying to think of a good example, managing attributes, for example, I really don't want to look under a certain vendor's name because I don't know it's there. Like, I know that this is a module vendor, but it doesn't fit into the flow of where things are in store configuration. I think this is the very same thing with what you're talking about as well. We can put it under, and I'm guilty of this myself. I used to put stuff under a SwiftOtter or the merchant's name tab, when in reality, probably 75% of what I'm putting in there has nothing to do specifically with this merchant, like functionality just for this merchant.
Yeah, and this is where some kind of balance also needs to be found, because you're totally right. When speaking about vendor, it's kind of legitimate for a vendor to kind of market the solution. So I do totally agree. It's kind of nice to have, this little small logo in the sidebar and make sure that everything is in there. And also for the user, it's interesting to have the access, to the licenses, because most of them use these sections to put some licenses and checks and stuff. And even having an addition in the main menu that leads to the right section within the configuration. That's right. So I agree that in terms of branding and maybe ease of maintenance for those vendors, it's easy to do that. But where I totally agree with you is that it could be confusing, because you may have, you spoke about attributes, but it's valid for anything. But for catalog, you may have some configuration regarding catalog, which will be within the vendor section, but would be much more legitimate to be within the catalog section.
That's right. That's well said. How do you suggest that you go about documentation? So you mentioned these legacy projects, right? And I think it's been a common thread of a lot of my podcasts over the past, month or two. There's a lot of complaints about, getting into this legacy code. We just inherited a rescue project, whatever. But what can we do to make it easier? So we have all these store configurations. Is it documented, do you think, enough? Just the fact that you can go through system.xml across a number of modules to kind of get a picture of what's there? Do you suggest there's any other or better ways for helping our future self, 6 months down the road, we forget about this project, or other developers coming in, we new hires, or even honestly handing it off to another company? How do you think we should better document these configuration settings?
So I think that the dev docs by itself is quite good, because you got everything in there. You can tweak things and find out what you want to do within reading the doc, and with experience you can try, fail, and retry, and that's okay. Right. And the thing is that within Magento, the configuration is very powerful, so you can do so many things with it. Create your own model, source model, front end, and renders and stuff. That's where it's so huge tool, but there is no best practice per se, or at least to my knowledge. And so this is why it's kind of dangerous, because you can do many, many things and you can mess things up quite quickly.
That's right.
And so based on my experience, and I would say it's kind of hard to give kind of a good recipe. But I would say the baseline to me is Magento is a framework. So the purpose of a framework is to give some rules. And so the best way to fit within this framework is basically to fit to the framework.
Exactly.
So what I mean is that the Magento team came up with an architecture regarding the modules, regarding the configuration, and everything kind of fit into place. You have a customer module or customer modules. You have configuration for customer. You have the same for catalog and so on, for sales, checkout, and so on. So I think that as soon as Magento is a solution with several features, they found out that there is this a good way to build the configuration based on this architecture. So my opinion is that you can easily find existing subsections that already exist in which you can put your own new configuration. But there's a huge problem here to me, is that in front of you have a client. And we all know that the configuration for the client, for the merchant, is kind of confusing, because you say it's powerful and it's good.
There's a lot there.
Yes, and the client does not want to see and to have to dig within configuration for some features that he or she does not use every day. So that's why, on the other hand, it could be interesting to have a section that gathers all the main configurations and specific configuration for this merchant, so that it's easier to get into the configuration.
Interesting.
And that's why we have to find out what's the best balance. Maybe it could be, okay, if you have to deal with a configuration that already exists, or if you're enriching an existing configuration, maybe fit to the framework and try to find out in which section you can put your own configuration. On the other hand, if you are working on a feature that is really specific, maybe you could create a new configuration, a new section or something like that. A good example to me is a store locator. There is no native feature of store locator per se within Magento, and it happens that you have to create your own store locator feature. And here, okay, what's the best area to put that? Would it be within content management? Would it be on a separate section or some other solution? And to me, that's where it's kind of difficult to make a good decision.
Absolutely. That's really well put. And the thing, as you were talking, is I came to remembrance here that there in the system.xml schema, there is a config path, which ultimately, if you wanted to call it duplicate two different configuration to two different places, so you have a merchant-specific entire tab to make it easy for them to reference there, as well as if you wanted to also really locate these throughout the configuration. I think, I haven't tried this, but I think you could use that config path so you have those duplicated fields, and you could take the duplicate field in the merchant-specific area, and you could then map it back to the place that fits within the framework.
Oh, that could be a good idea. So my point was to say that if maybe even for this merchant, if you're adding something on an existing feature, it will be legitimate for the merchant to go within the existing feature. If let's say I had this case the other day, I had to make some new rules regarding the category page and products list. So here it was very specific for this client, but I think that the client has to understand how catalog is configured, the grid per page, the number of items, and so on. So here I found legitimate to put this very specific configuration within the existing catalog config from Magento, because I think that the merchant has to dig a little bit within the configuration and make the solution its own. So putting here, it's kind of good. But if it's really, really specific on a feature that does not exist yet within Magento, here maybe gathering everything in the same section could be good. Another good point, I think maybe some people won't agree, but I'm a lazy guy. I think that sometimes it could be easier to put the new configuration within existing sections, because it's definitely easier for ACLs. I don't really like all the time to create ACLs, find the resource, create new files. So more code means more bugs.
That's absolutely.
So if we put the new configuration within existing sections, the ACLs already exist. So it could be easier to manage. You'll be more productive because you don't have to deal with the ACLs files. And so basically fewer bugs because you're not creating new things.
Very good. I like that. I really like that idea. This is good. That is a good advice. And the less code we have to write, and you said it's lazy. I honestly would challenge that word, because I think in a lot of ways it's really good to write less code. Now, obviously, if we're not meeting requirements, if we are, I don't know, not taking into account, I'm thinking specifically of like a total collector in Magento, where in order to do it right, we need to create an invoice total collector. We need to create a credit memo total collector. I mean, so there's a lot of extra pieces. So if that means we don't actually create those extra pieces, well, yeah, then that's lazy. But writing less code is really good. And I love what I'm hearing here, because the less code we can write, the more we can leverage of existing Magento features. It's just going to mean our code breaks less. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of bugs with Magento, and there still is, and I think those number of bugs hopefully is coming down, but it is what it is. It's a massive, massive system, but it still probably has less code than if you or I were just to go and write a bunch of code ourselves. There's going to be bugs in that, and Magento is pretty well vetted at this point. So the less code we can write, it's not being lazy. I think I call it working smart. So just a little little comment there.
Yeah, I agree. And the thing is, basically, it also comes down to what the client needs. Because, when I'm speaking about ACL, but we can think wider, is maybe the client will have some need for ACL, because maybe the new feature you're going to create needs to have specific permissions. And so what I said just before won't be valid. But same thing for gathering all the configuration within a section is maybe in front of you, you'll have a merchant which will be tech savvy, will already know Magento. So there is no need for this do it all section, I would say. So bottom line to me is that maybe it's really interesting to know what kind of savviness the client has and understand the need and maybe explain, okay, do you feel comfortable with the Magento configuration? Yes, no. If yes, okay, let's spread everything within the existing configuration framework, I can call it. If no, okay, let's try to negotiate and see, okay, would you feel more comfortable to have everything with your own logo? Maybe it will be easier for you also to train your teams and make sure that someone won't go like too deep in the configuration and change something that don't have to be changed. So it's also kind of balance between what the merchant needs and some kind of risk management too, because you don't want someone to go at the wrong place in the configuration and turn off something that is really critical for business.
Well, and Hervé, what I'm also hearing from you is thoughtfulness and intentionality. It's easy just to take one approach all the time. But what you were just saying there is asking the merchant, or even if one didn't ask the merchant, you can probably get a pretty quick idea as far as how technical they are, how much they know the Magento configuration, and actually tune the requirements to the primary user base at this merchant. And I really appreciate that about you, because it's so easy. And I'm not throwing shade at people who do this, but it's so easy. I can fall into this myself. We turn up the music and we just put our head down and we start coding. And I think there is a time and a place for that, but we risk losing that intentionality, that thoughtfulness. Okay, I'm building something that they need to use. So how can I fit this in? How can I craft this to the very best that they're going to need to use this, as opposed to me just getting the requirements banged out? You see, I think could be somewhat of a subtle difference, but ultimately at the end of the day, I think those subtle differences add up to be big differences for the merchant. Being intentional, thoughtful. Okay, this is how you're going to use it. I'm going to craft it in this way to meet your exact needs, as opposed to just what's set on paper or that ticket in front of us.
Yeah, and the good thing about that is also you can anticipate or limit unused support. Because if you do something that the user is not comfortable with, it will be like a call, hey, how to do that? Yes, it's in system configuration, this part, and the clearer you are, basically, and the best you fit the perimeter of what the merchant does or does not. It's then relevant support after that. I prefer having, I would say, relevant support for feature or for questions that are really legitimate, rather than, please, where do I have to click within the admin to find what I'm looking for? And that just happened this morning, and it took, 30 minutes to try to find what the customer was looking for and answer to this guy. And okay, he was very happy because I saved his morning life, Monday morning life. But then it was something I had to invoice, and it's not good for him. So that's the balance we have to find.
I agree. I totally agree. Absolutely. This is good. Let's talk about move on to the second phase of this question. And if you could give every developer one or two pieces of advice that really would make a difference, what would those pieces of advice be?
I think it's, if you're working with a legacy project, try to fit with what's in the legacy. If everything is under one section, okay. If you don't really agree, go with that, because otherwise you will confuse the user. That will be my first advice.
Well, let me stop you there, because I think one of the challenges if we're working on a legacy project or inherited project, it's easy to jump in and say, okay, well, we're going to start incrementally making this better. And so one of the first things we might do is say, well, why? It's really dumb. Why do we have it in all this configuration, this one section? Let's just start putting it now, sprinkling it out throughout the rest of the Magento configuration. And yet the reality is the merchant is probably totally used to it being in that one section. And as we start embedding it into the rest of that platform, or the rest of the store configuration, they're going to have some challenges finding it, which could ultimately taint their view of us as a new developer coming on to this project, because they're now no longer able to find it, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's what you're saying. Another way to put it would be like, we have to rein in our desire to do things the right way to fit within what has already been done.
So that's totally what I meant. And on top of that, it's also a way to avoid something that I dislike doing is, oh, those guys that work on the project before we do were bad guys, so now we're doing something better. And that's something that is not kind to other guys. So that's why I think it's another way to maintain consistency in the project and avoid loss of productivity also for the merchant.
That's good.
So that would be my first advice. And the second advice is more, it's purely tech, but would be to always populate the config.xml with the default values. Because it's something that's really important when you go to production, or when you change platform, or even if you want to pass over to other developers, they know what was the intended basic configuration. And so it's, in my opinion, it's really better for consistency and evolutivity. And also sometimes it may be required to complete this config.xml with a data patch if you know that you're changing a configuration that's already saved within the database on another environment. So having always this in mind, to me, is also a way to have fewer bugs, because I've seen so many times bugs that come just by the fact that some configuration is missing. And if you properly implement the config.xml, you do not have this kind of bugs.
And I completely agree. And I think one frustration can be is backwards compatibility. And when, like you mentioned specifically, a configuration that needs to be changed but has already been set in core config data, then we come back with, okay, well, yeah, we changed in config XML, but we forgot that it's actually already set in core config data. And so at that point, we have to then create a data patch. But keeping in mind the level of backward compatibility, I think, is really important, because in other words, if we miss that, then we are going to be getting callbacks and saying, hey, you deployed this code to production, but I don't see the change that you made here. And ultimately, making a change to system.xml or even config.xml seems like a very easy, simple change. And we might even have a junior developer do that. But at the end of the day, if we miss that data patch, that backward compatibility, we're kind of at the same place all over again.
Yeah, and that's my very own recipe when working with this config is, okay, am I developing a brand new feature for which I'm sure that no instance has this feature? If answer is yes, there's no need for data patch, because config XML will be the primer on that. But if the answer is no, I'm not sure that all instances are free of this new feature, then I will always implement a data patch to make sure that I can kind of force my new configuration. And so that's where I can ensure consistency, knowing that maybe there is a risk that you change a config on, let's say, on productions that were not supposed to be changed. But okay, that's kind of the balance to find also. But to me, it's more important to have something within core config data rather than nothing, because it's more bug prone to have empty configuration.
That's really good. Yeah, and I've to be frank, I have never thought about using, well, except for a rare occasion, using a data patch for updating values in core config data. But I think there's a lot of value or merit to that idea, and so it's something definitely I'll be thinking through myself and seeing where that, looking through an expanded set of use cases there to see where that will be provide additional value for when I create store configuration. This is really good. This is really good. Actually, the funny thing is I find myself creating less and less store configuration nowadays. I'm more fixing bugs and that kind of stuff as opposed to actually building a ton of new stuff lately. But I guess that's just where my stuff leads me. This is good. This is kind of about store configuration, like architecting of it, setting the values of it. And I love when we have these podcasts that are really hyper-focused, and there's some good takeaways from this. So this has been good. Thank you for coming on, Hervé.
Thank you for welcoming me. That was interesting chat.
Yes, it was absolutely fascinating, and I appreciate you coming on. And we'll have to do another chat like this in the future. Maybe another deep dive onto a subject in Magento. So this has been great. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. Look forward to doing it again. What an absolute pleasure it was to have Hervé on to talk through store configuration. And again, it's kind of, you might say, a lowly topic. I mean, store configuration, what's there to talk about? But there's a lot to talk about. And it's critical when we want to build applications that our merchants will love using, that is effective, that will make their life as easy as possible. And store configuration is a critical part of this. It's a common touch point. And again, we might look at it, well, it's so easy. It's just system.xml and config.xml. Those are the only things, well, maybe an acl.xml file too. But no, it goes so much deeper than that. Us being intentional about how this merchant is going to use this, understanding the merchant, and then building this store configuration in a way that aligns with their needs. That's what we talked about. And I hope this provides good insight, good encouragement to you as you continue on your journey to being a great e-commerce developer. It's been an absolute pleasure being with you here today. I hope you subscribe if you have not yet already. Leave a review as well. We'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear about what you think we should be talking about here in the future. As always, thank you for listening.